Buenas tardes. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Dublin. It's my great pleasure to welcome Juan Gómez Bárcena to Dublin, albeit virtually, to discuss his novel El Cielo de Lima, The Sky Over Berlin, over Lima. Juan, just a brief introduction. Juan Gómez Bárcena was born in Santander, or near Santander, in 1984. He has lived in Cordoba, in Budapest, in Mexico City, and Madrid. And he currently lives in Madrid, where he teaches creative writing. Those of you who've read the book will not be surprised to learn that he graduated in Teoría de la Literatura y Literatura Comparada, Literary Theory and Comparative Literature, at the Complutense University of Madrid. He's currently completing studies in philosophy at the National University of Distance Education and in history at the Complutense. Amongst his published works are El Héroe de Duranza, Los que Duermen, a first volume of stories, El Cielo de Lima, which we'll talk about this evening, Canada, and Ni siquiera los muertos. And he's just told me that his next book, Lo demás es aire, will be published in May. He just announced it yesterday. So, bienvenido, Juan. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Juan, I'm going to ask you just, first of all, to tell us about the genesis of this book. Here in Ireland, we're not at all surprised to hear about literary muses. We know about the impact that a woman can have on a man's writing, or a man on a woman's writing, but in particular, the impact of a woman on a man's writing. And I think that chimes beautifully with El Cielo de Lima. Can you tell us what prompted the story?
Well, actually, the first time that I thought about this story was a long time ago when I was at the school, because I had to make a research for my class about one Spanish author. I chose Juan Ramón Jiménez, and I found this weird story about how he fell in love with a woman didn't exist, and I thought it was a funny story, and I forgot that. But 10 or 12 years later, when I was 25, I was writing short stories about different topics, and I reminded this story, and I thought it could be a real interesting short story about idealization, something like that. But when I started to write, I realized that it wasn't a short story, and I started to write more and more, and it was 300 pages, and it was a real surprise for me too. And and that's what the story, the genesis of the story, and because it's a true story in many ways, but I made a lot of changes when I started to write about that.
So you plundered the past.
Especially because we don't know a lot of things about this episode. We only know that two young poets, two Peruvian poets, started to write Juan Ramón Jiménez letters in 1904, pretending to be a woman called Georgina Hübner. And we know that Juan Ramón Jiménez this Spanish poet, fell in love with this creation. But we don't know anything more. We know that the name of Georgina Hübner actually was the name of the cousin of Carlos Rodriguez, one of the young poets. And but when I started to write the story, I thought that it was more interesting as quit this character, the cousin, and focus only in the idea that Georgina Hübner was a complete creation without any model. And we know some things about one of the young poets, about José, because it's funny, because José, 50 years later, was the president of Senado. I don't. Parliament? Yeah, about the president of the Parliament of Peru. It was a real surprising thing, but we don't know anything about Carlos, and for this reason I chose that as my main character, because I could invent a lot of things. I really like to focus always in the past in my books, but I like as well change and make additions or erase some things about the past and make a lot of changes about that.
So it's just a launching point for you. It's a launching pad. You start from there and then you go wherever you choose. Yeah. Could I ask you to read a little piece from the opening pages of the novel, just by way of introduction? And if you read it in Spanish, I'll read it in English immediately afterwards.
Okay, perfect. La primera vez parece una broma, pero luego resulta que no es una broma. Uno de los dos dice casi sin pensarlo: sería más fácil si fuéramos una mujer bonita. Verías cómo entonces a don Juan Ramón se le iba el alma en contestarnos, esa alma suya de violeta. Y entonces se interrumpe de pronto. Los dos jóvenes se miran un momento y casi sin quererlo, la travesura ya está urdida. Ríen, se felicitan por la ocurrencia, intercambian palmadas y vasos de pisco, y a la mañana siguiente se reúnen en la buhardilla con un pliego de papel perfumado que Carlos se ha acordado de robar del escritorio de su hermana. Es también el propio Carlos quien escribe: tantas veces se burlaron en el liceo de su caligrafía de mujer, de letras redondas y suaves como una caricia, y por fin ha llegado la hora de sacarle algún partido. Cuando usted quiera, señor Gálvez, dice conteniendo la risa, y juntos comienzan a recitar esas palabras largamente maduradas para las que solo necesitan papel verjurado y un escribiente con letra de mujer. Ese poema sin versos, que no recogerá ningún libro, pero que está a punto de hacer lo que solo sabe la mejor poesía: nombrar lo que nunca antes ha existido y darle vida. De esas palabras nacerá Georgina, tímidamente al principio, porque así es como escogen que sea, una jovencita miraflorina que suspira con los versos de Juan Ramón y cuya candidez les hace reír en las pausas. Una muchacha que de tan ingenua solo puede ser bonita. Es ella la que pide un ejemplar de Arias Tristes, ella la que está tan avergonzada por su atrevimiento, ella la que ruega al poeta que la disculpe y la comprenda. Falta la firma, y con ella un apellido sonoro y poético, que acuerdan tras un largo debate en el que agotan las bebidas y las pastas: Georgina Hübner. Y Georgina empieza por ser solo eso, un nombre y una carta lacrada que viajará de mano en mano durante más de un mes, primero en el escote de la criada analfabeta, más tarde en el bolsillo del mozo que por el encargo cobra medio sol y un pellizco en el inmenso culo africano de la sirvienta. Después pasará por las manos de dos empleados de correos, un estibador aduanero y un marinero de línea. De ahí al vapor que cubre el trayecto Lima-Montevideo, en un saco de cartas en el que por lo general abundan las malas noticias. De Montevideo, un rodeo innecesario hasta Asunción, por la negligencia de un cartero al que le faltan 30 días para jubilarse y la vista necesaria para entender las caligrafías pequeñas. De Asunción, en tren de nuevo hasta Montevideo, a través de la selva, para embarcarse en la bodega de un buque, donde se salvará de forma milagrosa de las mandíbulas de una rata que antes ha dejado irreconocibles otras muchas cartas. The microphone.
It starts out as a joke, but then it turns out it's not a joke. One of the two says, almost idly, "It would be easier if we were a beautiful woman." Then Don Juan Ramón would put his entire soul into answering us, that violet soul of his. And then suddenly he stops. The two young men look at each other a moment, and almost unintentionally, mischief has already been made. They laugh, congratulate each other on this inspired idea, exchange slaps on the back, and 2 more glasses of pisco. And the next morning they meet up in the garret with a sheet of perfume paper that Carlos has remembered to pilfer from his sister's desk. Carlos also takes care of the writing. His schoolmates used to tease him about his feminine handwriting, the letters soft and round like a caress. And the time has finally come to put it to good use. Whenever you're ready, Senor Galvez, he says, stifling his laughter. And together they begin to sound out those timeless words that require only a sheet of fine paper and a writer with a womanly hand. A poem with no verses, which will appear in no anthology, but that is poised to do what only the best poetry can. Name what has never existed before and bring it to life. From those words, Georgina will be born, timidly at first, because that's how they write her, a young lady from Miraflores who sighs over the poetry of Juan Ramón and whose artless sincerity makes them laugh during their pauses. A girl so ingenious that she can only be beautiful. It is she who requests a copy of Sad Arias, she who is so ashamed of her own audacity, she who begs the poet to understand and to forgive her. Only the signature is missing, and with it a last name, sonorous and poetic, that the two finally agree on after a debate so long that both the liquor and the pastries run out. Georgina Hübner. And Georgina begins as simply that, a name and a sealed letter that will travel from hand to hand for more than a month, first in the bodice of the illiterate housemaid, then in the pocket of a lad who charges half a sol and a pinch of the maid's broad buttocks for the errand. It will then pass through the hands of 2 postal workers, a customs official at the docks, and a sailor, and thence to the steamship covering the Lima-Montevideo route in a sack of letters in which bad news predominates. From Montevideo, an unnecessary detour to Asunción, thanks to a negligent postman only 30 days from retirement, whose eyesight is too weak to read the delicate handwriting. From Asunción, back to Montevideo by train through the jungle, and then setting sail in the hold of a ship where it will miraculously be saved from the jaws of a rat that has left many other letters utterly unreadable in the past. Thank you, Juan. So the joke begins. And as you developed the joke and created these 2 characters to your liking, what was in your mind? Were you inventing them blind, or did you have a cousin like Carlos who inspired you? How did you make these 2 characters?
Well, at this moment, I was very insecure about how to make a novel. So, and especially I had a lot of problems to create characters, because I have, for me, it's easy some parts of writing, but characters are very difficult for me. And I started to think about Carlos and Jose in a very mathematic way. I thought, okay, I have to decide, for example, which is their social class. And I thought, wow, in 1904, I suppose only rich people or most of rich people read poetry, so they have to be rich. But I thought, okay, I have to make differences between Carlos and Jose. So I thought, well, maybe I can decide that Jose was a very rich one, but a guy from a very ancient family, very historical family in Peru. So it's he has the correct blood, because it's a very racist society in that moment. And I thought, well, Carlos has to be the opposite. He has to have money, but probably dirty money. it's not so I started to make this kind of differences between them, and very slowly, but I can define the two characters. And it was funny because I made an exercise when I started to write. I tried to define these characters in only, I don't know, 12 words or something like that. And when I made that, I thought, well, maybe I can put these 12 words in the novel and then explain each word in a lot of more words, and started to define the characters from these 12 words. And well, it was very hard for me because, as I am saying, I have a lot of problems with characters. It's difficult for me. But slowly I can define more or less well their personalities, and especially the character of Carlos. I wanted to make a modern, I don't know how to say, a guy with modern sensibility in 1904. It's like, it's not the normal way of being a man in 1904. It's more sensitive. He has some sensibility about women, but Jose don't. He's more adequate to his time. So I started in that way, and well, more or less I could define slowly these characters between with this kind of thinkings about it.
So one was from old money and the other was from, it was nouveau riche in a sense, was dirty money. As you say, why was money so important? Why was social class so important? Why was the stratification of Peruvian society so important? Was it just to give them color, or was there more to it than that?
Sorry,
why was class
Me está preguntando por qué el dinero y las clases sociales están importantes, si era por darle color a la novela o si tiene
okay. As you can see, I have here my translator, my girlfriend. She's helping me because it's only my second time speaking English in an event, so I try to do my best.
You're very good.
But I need her help. Yes, I think it was a really important thing because, well, first off, Peruvian society was very racist in this time. And I thought that it was important to make a picture about this kind of social differences. It was important for the atmosphere of the time. And I thought if we only focus in very rich people, men who don't care about poor or about women, that we are very I don't know, aparted or oprimidas. Limited for his time, for her society. So it was important for me to make these differences and to focus in this kind of things, because it was very relevant to make a picture about this time. And it was interesting for me too, because it's a very interesting time. Precisely in the first years of the 20th century, there was there were a lot of Peruvian rich people from the I don't know in English, I think it's the rubber culture.
Yes, rubber
okay.
plantations.
Yeah. It was a very short time, and in this short time, rubber was, I don't know, expensive as gold. So a lot of people could make a lot of money, an incredible,
very
fast, like with petroleum or petroleum, right? Yeah. So I thought it was interesting make a picture about this this fever of rubber too, as well, one of my favorite films do the same thing, Fitzcarraldo, the film of Werner Herzog. It's set in the same place and in the same time, more or less. So for these reasons was important for me to make a picture about the society and about the time.
And I think it also helped you with the plot, because it gave you scenarios in which you could place the two principal characters. Tell me a little about the skirmish they have at the docks when Carlos gets injured.
Well, I was thinking that it was, well, because I heard about the episode, the real episode, but it's a very short episode, and I thought, well, here has to happen something, some obstacles in between Juan Ramón Jiménez and these young poets. And I thought it was interesting if the letters couldn't cross the ocean. And I started to research, and I discovered precisely in 1904 was huelga?
Strike.
Yeah, a strike. Yeah, a strike in the docks of Lima, and it was a very interesting episode because it was the first riots and the first strike asking for the journey of 8 hours for worker people, and so there was
demanding a working day.
Yeah,
of 8 hours
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And there were well, anarchism is the word, anarchism, and there were communism, and it was, well, quite interesting in 1904. And I thought, well, I think it's the perfect pretext, the perfect excuse to say, okay, the letters can't cross the ocean, and now they have to do something to achieve, to communicate with Juan Ramón Jiménez. And yes, as you say, sometimes when I was when I didn't know how to continue the plot of the novel, normally the real events give me a lot of ideas about what can happen in every moment of the book.
So where did you do your research? Did you go to Peru?
No.
How did you find out about the strike?
Actually, I didn't, and it's funny because, well, later I wrote a book about Hungary, and I lived in Hungary a short time, and I wrote about Mexico, and I lived in Mexico too. But actually, I've never been in Peru, but I think it's not real hard to make this work because, as a matter of fact, Peruvian people don't know Peru in 1904 either. So I use a lot, a mountain of documentation, books about everything, gastronomy, or I don't know, the prostitution in Lima in 1905, or strikes, well, a lot of things. And with this research, I think I could make more or less a good work with the documentation. Well, actually, I found, I think, 2 mistakes about the Peruvian readers sometimes say, that's not exactly correct, because it's interesting. But yeah, I think it was a funny thing, because they well, the book is set in Peru, and they are writing to Juan Ramón Jiménez in Madrid, and I write the book in Madrid, thinking about Peru. So it was like a crossing story.
Serendipitous. That's lovely. I wanted to, you mentioned the research you did into prostitution, and prostitution, in a sense, bookends the book. Early in the book, there's this horrific scene where Carlos is initiated into sex when his father takes him to a very upmarket brothel, and that description is heartbreaking because, in effect, both Carlos and the young Polish girl are both children. Why did you choose to tackle that way?
Well, I thought I needed a scene where we can see the way that his father oppressed him, and because Carlos is a character who is always trying to be a different thing, a different person, different from not following the desires of his family. And I read this incredible thing about how, with the fever of rubber was on the top, rich people bought girls, virgin girls from Europe, because they wanted to have white girls, because not indigenous or not girls from Peru. They wanted especially Polish girls or Russian girls.
Another kind of racism. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And a very hard one. And they sold her virginity. In one night, they could pay comparing with our prices, something like 40,000 euros. 40,000, yes, 40,000 euros for a night with a girl. And the next day, this girl is one euro, because she is not virgin anymore. So it was for me a very incredible thing to write about, and to write about racism too, and about well, how rich people do strange things in every time, in our time too. And it's like well, sometimes related in my head with neoliberalism and this kind of this kind of stuff, because one of my ideas was trying to make some comparisons between our time and their time. Not very explicit, is
not overtly, not openly, but subtly.
Yeah, not openly, but yeah, I think it's under the text, these kind of comparisons. Yes.
And the second final scene where Carlos is with the prostitute is so different. Can you explain a little bit again why? And I think I know the answer. Why there is so much time spent with the second prostitute where there's no sexual congress whatsoever?
Well, I think he's trying to create, or to bring to life his creation. He's trying to see Georgina. Georgina didn't exist, but in the prostitute, it's like a doll for him. He's trying to dress, and you have to do that, and you don't have to do that. Actually, I was inspired, but because by my favorite film, Vertigo, for Alfred Hitchcock. In Vertigo, you have the same scene. It's a film about idealization too. And James Stewart is trying to, okay, you have to have the hair in that way, and you have to have these clothes, because he's trying to create his fantasy too. So for me, it was an inspiration for this scene, because Carlos has, well, is more, he has more sensibility than Jose, but at the end, is a man of his time, and girls are only, girls are only two things, or a prostitute or a fantasy, but he can't meet a real and a woman from I don't know how to say, but I think you can understand me. Yeah, he can't, of course, he can't see a friend in a girl. That's impossible. Only a way to improve your spirit, your soul, or only a way to make real your fantasies in bed, actually.
And of course, the creation of the fantasy with the prostitute is like the power of creation that the novelist has. And this book is a lot of the time about the power of the novelist. You play with the reader. You talk about characters who might go one way and might go another way, and you will decide. I think there's a quote at one stage where you say, you talk about a prostitute and you say, when Carlos visits a brothel, the authorial voice points out that the prostitute lacks the discreet beauty of secondary characters designed to entertain for a single chapter and then disappear without trace. Perhaps aware of her minor role in Georgina's novel, she doesn't even open her mouth. So you're talking to the reader in the voice of the author. It was almost like breaking the fourth wall on the stage. Did you enjoy doing that, and how has it been received?
Yeah, I enjoyed a lot with these kind of strategies. Actually, I didn't repeat this kind of techniques later, only in this book, but it was really funny and really interesting. This time I was so interested in books, for example, in the unbearable, I don't know how to translate that, Milan Kundera.
The unbearable likeness of being.
Okay, well, I was so interested on John Fowles in the wife of the French lieutenant, maybe, or something like that, the title. And this kind of books is quite interesting for me, how the author is always between two worlds, in the world of the fiction and in the world of the readers, and is always crossing the border between two worlds. And well, this kind of metafictional way of writing. And I thought it was interesting, these techniques, for my book, because actually it's a book about how two writers are creating a character. And I was a writer who was creating two characters.
Who are creating a character.
So you have a lot of levels, of fiction. And I was quite interested in this kind of games.
There are a lot of them in the book. I mean, you talk about 249 pages of letters to Georgina, and guess what page this reference occurs on? On page 249.
Exactly. And I have a character in the book. I don't know how to say in English, a man who you pay for writing your letters. I don't know.
A public scribe, a letter writer. We used to have them in Ireland too. When there was a lot of illiteracy, you would go to a person and pay them to write. But your character who writes the letters is quite a character. Tell us about him.
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting for me because it's like, in many ways, is the author of the book, because he has a big, I don't know, a big vision, a big picture of the world of the book, and it was interesting for me because I decided put in his mouth a lot of ideas of postmodernism, ideas from the 60s and the 70s, but 70 years before. It's like he can have an incredible approach to a lot of times, and he's writing, or he's speaking about how love is in many ways a creation, and it's an idea is not for this time. It's a postmodernist idea maybe, and it was funny for me to make this kind of games all the time.
Yeah, I think at one stage you talk about Lacan and Foucault, and you say that what you'd love, the authors would have loved to get advice from them, but they couldn't possibly, because one of them hadn't been born and the other was sitting on this carpet in Paris playing with Lego.
I thought I create this part of the sentence with Lacan because I realized, oh shit, he is alive actually, but well, he only has 2 years, so it's okay. I can make. It was. I think it's the funniest part of the book for me. This kind of exercises about literature and about creation.
They really are very clever. But you also have a character. I would say he is a character in the rat. In the ship.
Yeah.
Why is there a rat in the ship? Because you bring us up these cul-de-sacs and we're all waiting and expecting the plot to go in one particular direction, and then something happens and we're taking another direction. So the rat doesn't play a central role as he might have.
Yeah, well,
tell us about the rat. Yeah.
Yes, I read that in this time there were a lot of rats in the ships, and sometimes these rats ate the letters, and you can't receive it. So I thought it was, well, interesting and funny to make a chapter from the point of view of the rat, who is thinking if she's going to eat this letter or this one. And actually it was the second chapter that I wrote, because I always write not in a linear order.
Out of sequence.
And a lot of times I write a lot of chapters that I am not sure if these chapters are going to be in the book, but I can try it. And I think it's one of my favorite chapters in the book. It's quite different from the rest of the book, but I think it's it's like a game too. I think it's there. I am thinking now that there are a lot of game in this book. It's just strange for me to speak about this book because I published it 8 years ago, and now it's it's a great excuse to think about this book again.
It's certainly great fun to read. I have a couple of questions here for you.
Okay.
I have a question from Oya, and she says, the story seems to combine nostalgia and a subtle sense of humor in a very interesting way. Have you paid attention to avoid creating a very serious character? I thought it was it was easy to slide the book to the comedy or to the tragedy, and I didn't want that, because I realized that when I was writing,
you can interpret the book or the story in the two different ways. It's like this film of Woody Allen, Melinda and Melinda. It's a film where there was a tragic author and a comedy author, and they are discussing if the one story is a comedy or a tragedy. And I realized it. You can understand the story in the two ways, and I thought that it was interesting trying to combine this tragedy or comedy all the time. But I think in many ways I am a sad author, and I think, yeah, you can laugh in a lot of moments of the book, or I hope so. But yeah, the end of the book and the whole idea, I think, probably is sad. Yeah, more sad than that funny, I think. Normally, that's the way of my literature. Well, my last book is not exactly that, but normally I do that.
And I suppose, just to carry on from what Oya has said there, that in some ways this book is about creative failure.
El fracaso de la creación.
Yeah, well, yeah, about the I think it's both things, because yeah, it's the failure. It's a failure creation because they don't have anything at all at the last part of the book, but. Well, in many ways, Juan Ramón Jiménez had a real experience at the end. He was, well, and that's interesting because the real story is that 30 or 40 years later, Juan Ramón Jiménez discovered that these two guys were making a joke with him, and he said something really interesting for me. He said, well, it doesn't matter, for me it was a real love. And so I say thank you to these jokers, because it wasn't a joke for me at all. And this love was real. And I think it's true. When you believe something in a very deep way, in many ways this is happening actually. This is happening inside you. So yeah, it's I think it's interesting because yeah, the creation is a failure, but it's a great goal too. I don't know how to say, but yeah, accomplishment. Well, thank you.
Achievement and accomplishment.
Achievement, right.
So Juan, there's another comment here and question from Liz Morris, and she says, have you given talks about this book in Peru? And what has been the reaction to your book in Peru? And she says, ojalá mi español fuera la mitad de bueno que tu inglés.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy right now. Yes, I made some meetings with readers in Peru. Not a lot of, but I think 2, if I am right. And I received some letters from Peru too. Emails actually, not letters in a sheet, but
no more epistolary novels.
And yes, and I think I answered some interviews when the book came to Peru, and normally I found a very good I don't know, receivement, no, acogida.
Was well received.
Yeah, was well received. The book. Sometimes, as I said before, I received 2 or 3. Oh, you can correct that because it's not exactly, and I and I'm really happy to hear these kind of things. And I think it was a relief hear this kind of messages, because sometimes relation between Spain and Latin America is quite complicated, because well, I am writing about their country, and I came from the metropole. I don't know if the name in the colonies, the colonial country, and sometimes it could be received in a bad way, because you are appropriating something that belongs.
There could be a question raised about cultural appropriation. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm happy because yeah, always, or not always maybe, but yeah, I heard some things about that, good things about that. They say that well, they don't feel that like I am appropriating his culture. But they think that I am well, giving importance to his country and to his culture, or their culture. Well, that was more difficult with my last book, because my last book was about history of colonization in Mexico and Spain, and right now there is a very difficult relation between Mexico and Spain about the memory of the colonization of history. But yes, I usually have a good response, a good answers from Peru. Yes.
So the book was well received.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember seeing an interview you did on Spanish television, where you talked about how your books are received generally, and you seem to suggest that this book was not your favorite, but that it had more success than, say, Canada.
Yeah, that's right.
Why do you prefer a later book to this book?
Well, I think when you started to write, and you are trying to, I don't know, to get your voice, or to understand exactly what do you want to say. And this book was so important for me. I think it's the most important book for me that I wrote, because with this book I got a lot of translations, and I could receive attention before nobody knew me in Spain, and it was so important for me too, because I learned a lot about writing, and especially about how to create a novel, because it's really difficult to get the structure and to planificate the book. Well, I learned a lot about that, but I think the book it's not clearly related to my interests and to my way to see the world. Maybe, I don't know. The books that I published later, I think, are more related with me, and well, it's normal too. Maybe it's a narcissist thing, but when you read a book that you published years ago, you can say, oh my God, no, this sentence is horrible. How can I write that? But I think it's narcissist, because, well, it's the best thing that I wrote in one moment of my life, and I'm really happy with that. But I think the thing is that I thought that my next book was better, and I was so angry with when I saw that a lot of readers don't agree with me, and you are, no, I am right. Well, that's not really important for me.
Well, it's certainly been a very pleasurable experience reading the book. I think all that remains for me to do really is to thank you, and to ask if anybody else has any more questions, and if they don't see any more in the chat, but I do see somebody saying, tengo muchas ganas de leer este libro y de leer el libro sobre México. So you've developed a new fan base today, both for this book and for the current books and future books. So muchísimas gracias, Juan Gómez Bárcena.
Gracias.
And I'll pass you back to Laura Martín, who will say a few words of closure. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much. I have spent a great time. So thank you for your introduction and for your questions. So thank you.
Hasta la próxima. Muchísimas gracias. And thank you to the audience.